Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
An overcrowded bus pulled up to the bus stop. There didn't seem to be any empty seats left inside. But Adriana knew that was an illusion. If you wanted to, the buses had a way of stretching to infinity and accommodating an unreal number of passengers in a dense stream of people. Adriana was carried into the cabin and forcefully pressed into someone's back. She sucked in her stomach and exhaled to take up as little space as possible. Well, thank God, here we go. We'll pass on the fare. The driver's angry voice boomed through the cabin, and it was easy for him to say, pass the fare. You can only stand there with your hands at your sides and money in your purse on your shoulder. Though I think the change was in her down jacket pocket. Adriana somehow twisted and extracted the coins from her pocket. Woman. An indignant woman in a heavy coat ahead of her resented her, smelling of perfume and asphyxiating. Did you step on my foot? Sorry, muttered Adriana to herself, mentally adding that you do not allow me to breathe. This was the ritual quest she went through every day. First on her way to work, and then from work in the overcrowded bus during rush hour. Adriana got used to it and didn't complain. But sometimes she was so desperately jealous of people with private cars. Sitting in a warm cabin in comfort. Listen to music, go wherever you want. She should have never got her driver's license, though she was going to get it in a driving school. However, even if she had her license, Adriana would never have enough money for a car in her life. And still even soberly assessing her financial capabilities, Adriana liked to dream, standing in a stuffy, overcrowded bus, and feeling like one of the herrings in a barrel. She excitedly imagined that one day she would have a lot of money. It was unclear how, but she would definitely have lots of it. Now Adriana worked as an office manager in a small company and received a very modest salary. There was no hope of a job change. Who would keep an employee who was always on sick leave with a child? Even at her present place of employment, she was tolerated to the utmost. So Adriana dreamed of getting rich in some completely unreal, miraculous way, for example, discovering a treasure right in her yard in the sandbox. Or help some old lady cross the street, and she would turn out to be a billionaire and write a will in her name. Or maybe she would win the lottery. How she got the money wasn't important. What mattered was how she would spend it. In the girl's dreams, she had enough for a car and an apartment. Now she and her son were living in a tiny one-room apartment, and she would be able to buy Michael all the toys he just asked. She would no longer have to save money to drag from paycheck to grovel at the social fund, obtaining a child allowance and providing a lot of certificates. She and Michael would be able to travel. God be with them, with foreign countries. At least they could go to the sea. Adriana hadn't been to the sea in 100 years. She was so lost in her dreams that she almost missed the nursery school, immersed in her sweet dreams. Adriana came to her senses only when the bus tried to dash past. The stop she needed. Oh, wait, she shrieked shrilly. I'm getting off, and began to make her way through the dense mass of human bodies. She immediately began to scold on all sides. Where are you going? Careful, woman. Clumsy cow. You should dream less. She came to her senses. You've bruised your fingers. The driver wasn't in debt either. You should have warned him. He yelled angrily. When Adriana made her way to the door, it was an emergency stop. I don't have to stop here. I'm sorry. Adriana, swallowing her tears as best she could, and trying to control herself, she fell out of the stuffy and crowded bus right into the wet, muddy snowdrift, and the driver immediately drove off, scrambling out of the snowdrift, feeling her thin boots soak instantly. Adriana found that she had lost one glove, probably dropped it, on the shuttle bus as we made our way to the exit. It was great. I couldn't tell you anything. My paycheck was a week and a half away and only $800. The expense of a new pair of gloves didn't fit Adriana's modest budget. Still, she tried to be optimistic. The weather wasn't too cold anyway, not winter at all. It had been raining for a second day, turning the white snow underfoot into a mess. In above freezing temperatures, she could survive without gloves, telling herself not to get upset. Adriana walked hurriedly toward the kindergarten. There was not good news waiting for her in group. Michael had had a sore throat all evening. A worried Adriana put her palm to his forehead. It didn't look hot yet, but it started that way all the time. A sore throat, a cough, and then a fever. God, was he really going to be sick again? He's only been in kindergarten for a week. Your child was the last one left in the group. She was reproached by a disgruntled teacher. The other children had all been taken home long ago. Adriana shrugged her shoulders. And what do you suggest I do? The garden is open until 7. I'm not late yet, but they all get picked up much earlier. I can't. Early cut Adriana off. I have work to do. The teacher shook her head as if she were surprised at what a heartless mother she is. Lots of people have jobs, she said indignantly. But somehow grandmothers and grandfathers and aunts manage. We have no grandparents or aunts. Adriana answered dryly and began to dress the sluggish son. Michael and I are all alone at home. She tucked her son into bed. She checked his forehead again. It is hot. What's the matter with him? She slipped a thermometer under his arm. She checked the supply of medicine. She ran out of everything. And antipyretics and antivirals. She had to rush to the 24-hour pharmacy. The thermometer read 38.2. Sighing, Adriana knelt down in front of the bed and asked Michael affectionately, "My little bunny, stay home alone for half an hour. I have to go to the pharmacy and get you some medicine." The son nodded languidly. He usually didn't like to be alone at home, even for a little while. But now, apparently, he had nothing better to do. I quickly promised Adriana as I threw on my down jacket. She pulled out her wallet and frantically counted the cash. Nothing had changed since this morning. $200. And not a penny more, and there were $600 on the card. Adriana sighed heavily, and they still had to get by on their paychecks. But there was nothing to be done. The child's health is more important. Despite January outside, everything was dripping and flowing, diligently jumping over puddles that resembled rivers in their gigantic size. Adriana galloped to the drugstore. The medicine cost her $700. That was a week and a half and $100 before her paycheck. She'd have to borrow it from someone else. On her way home, she passed a little old church. Adriana didn't consider herself particularly religious, even though she was baptized. But now she suddenly slowed down involuntarily. She admired the domes of the small church. People poured out of the church. Apparently, the evening service was over. Adriana didn't know much about it. Along the church fence, several beggars and homeless people stood or sat, and parishioners served them in their caps or directly into the palm of their hands. Adriana shuddered. No matter what she said, she had a sin. To complain. At least she and Michael had a roof over their heads, and always enough for bread and butter and hot soup. These people have to beg and shiver in the wind. Suddenly her gaze lingered on one man in the line of beggars. It was a young man sitting in a wheelchair. His head was lowered and his face was impossible to see, but something familiar appeared to Adriana in the silhouette. She approached her impertinently. The man was definitely familiar to her with the tilt of his head, the line of his shoulders. The thick curls reminded her very much of her former boss. Suddenly, the man raised his head and met her gaze. She gasped instantly, recognizing those eyes, that nose, those lips. "Ethan, not believing you said Adriana." He focused his gaze on her and said incredulously to Adriana. They had met 7 years before. Adriana had just graduated, and she had been invited to intern at a well-known law firm. The owners of the firm were two men, Ethan and Benjamin. They were not only partners for each other, but also childhood friends. Both were known as the best attorneys in town, despite the fact that both were barely in their 30s. Young, attractive, smart, and single on top of that. All of Adriana's former classmates and girlfriends were jealous. Lucky you. They sighed. You hang around with such gorgeous men all day long. Don't get lost. You'll be a lawyer's wife in no time. But Adriana didn't like that kind of joke. I don't want to be a lawyer's wife, she shook her head. I want to be a famous lawyer myself. The classmates twiddled their thumbs with their temples. Silly girl, where are you going to go? The world of lawyers consists of strong and confident men. It's not women's territory. the best you can hope for in the future. It's to sit in some notary's office and help draw up powers of attorney and wills. Adriana preferred not to argue, but still stuck to her opinion. She dreamed that someday she would be a true professional like Ethan and Benjamin. In the meantime, she didn't shy away from any job. As long as she was allowed to watch her bosses at work, it was an unparalleled pleasure. By the way, the lawyers treated Adriana with respect, despite the fact that she was only yesterday's law student. Young but very determined and ambitious. Adriana had no doubts about her prospects. On the outside, Ethan and Benjamin looked like absolute antipodes. Ethan, a swarthy brunette with penetrating black eyes. Benjamin was a good-natured blonde with a simple but disposing freckled face. They were also complete opposites in character. Ethan is always serious, focused, reserved, silent. If it wasn't about work, Benjamin is a joker and a jolly man, the soul of the company. When he was in the office, only his voice was heard. He immediately began to give Adriana the most unambiguous signs of attention. Constantly complimented how she looked or smelled. He admired her wit and efficiency. More than once he hinted that he'd lost his head over her. Adriana joked it off as best she could. In response to his advances, which were becoming more and more intrusive by the day. What about Adriana? More than once he told her with a wink. Let's go to a restaurant after work. A new one opened the other day. It's really fancy. But the food there is excellent. It's my treat. And then we can go to the movies or the theater or just go for a walk. Thanks for the invitation, Benjamin. But I can't. Adriana always refused. Can't or won't. He insisted. I can't and I don't want to. She answered honestly. It is necessary to separate the flies from the cutlets, relationships, work. No intrigues with colleagues. That is my firm conviction. My principle, if you want to know. Otherwise, it would really interfere with your career. Benjamin seemed genuinely chagrined in response to her unwavering refusal. Look, how principled is she. He sighed. Well, you can't force the issue. Perhaps if Adriana classmates heard these conversations, they would have thought she was crazy to refuse Benjamin himself. Who does she think she is? That's why Adriana didn't tell anyone about it. In fact, time after time, in refusing Benjamin, she had been a little deceitful. She was not so principled. For instance, if Ethan, not Benjamin, had called her to the restaurant, she would have said yes without hesitation. Adriana knew that this dream was a pipe dream. Men like Ethan, unapproachable, proud, attractive, hardly paid attention to gray mice like her. In fact, like many girls her age, Adriana underestimated herself. She had what was called natural beauty about her. True, she did not seek to accentuate it in any way. She never put bright lipstick on her pouty lips, using colorless gloss, and hid her expressive, gray-blue eyes behind the lenses of her stern-framed glasses. She thought the glasses made her look more solid, like a real lawyer. Beautiful, thick, blonde hair. She slicked it back and tucked it into a bun at the nape of her neck. In the office, she wore clothes in black, gray, and beige shades, and all styles were strict and emphasized businesslike. No wonder Ethan did not pay any attention to her at all, like a man to a woman. But as a professional, he appreciated her very much, and Adriana had to be content with that. In fact, of course, she was very flattered by his praise. Ethan repeatedly told her that she was good, that she had a great future as a lawyer, and every time she blushed embarrassingly, ready to soar with happiness. Sometimes Ethan would introduce her to the details of a particular criminal case he was currently handling and ask her for advice. Really? On an equal footing. As if he was really interested in the opinion of a green, inexperienced intern. But Adriana's answers were often correct, and Ethan nodded contentedly. That's right. Adriana, you captured the essence brilliantly. Adriana had long scrolled through his words and dreamed that one day Ethan would look at her differently, not just as a boss to a subordinate. Unfortunately, her sympathy for Ethan did not go unnoticed. Betty also worked at the firm. She was the personal assistant to both attorneys. She was a spectacular, brash, intelligent, and perceptive young woman. For some reason, She immediately disliked Adriana. As soon as she showed up at the office from the beginning of her internship at the firm, Adriana sensed Betty's obsessive attention to her person. It was as if the woman was waiting for Adriana to back off and make even the slightest mistake. But Adriana wasn't going to give her that pleasure, and that made Betty's heart throb even more. What had I done to her? More than once, Adriana was perplexed. Where had I crossed her? Once, accidentally, in a hurry to deliver important papers, she broke into Ethan's office without knocking and caught Betty. She didn't have time to see what the two were doing there. But when she saw them, Betty staggered away from Ethan and took a few steps to the side. It made Adriana's insides literally sink. Were they hugging, kissing, or just talking confidentially about something? "Excuse me, Ethan. A courier finally dropped off the paperwork on the Stephen case. You told me to tell you right away." "Adriana," Betty whispered sarcastically, pale with anger. "Weren't you taught to knock before you came in? I thought you had a college education, and you don't know such elementary things." Adriana turned red as a beet. Tears came to her eyes from embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she repeated, barely audible. "I was in a hurry, and I did not think the next time said Betty, pulling on his elegant jacket. "Thinking in general is a good thing, you know. I highly recommend it." "Well, that's enough, Betty." Ethan interrupted her sternly. "I suppose Adriana has already realized her mistake and repented. Besides, she has apologized twice. And I really am waiting for those papers." With a contemptuous grimace, Betty knocked her heels out of the office. "Give me the papers." Adriana nodded to Ethan, who suddenly noticed that she was not herself red, upset, hurt. "Are you upset because of Betty's words?" he clarified. "Will you please stop? It's all right. I'm not angry with you." "Thank you," shyly Adriana said, fearing that one more second, and she would cry in shame, like some schoolgirl. Approaching the warden's desk, she held out a stack of papers to Ethan. He took it, and for a split second, their fingers touched. Adriana felt as if she'd been electrocuted. She jerked her hand away hastily, only then realizing how silly it must have looked. She glanced at Ethan sideways and caught the look in his eyes. A thoughtful look. The color of embarrassment burned her cheeks again. What the hell is wrong with her? All she does today is blush and embarrass herself in front of him and blush and embarrass herself again. Ethan suddenly smiled fondly at her and winked at her in a way that was completely out of place. "I'll go," reluctantly she asked. Ethan nodded. "Sure, Adriana, go ahead. I won't keep you any longer." Adriana stormed out of the office like a bullet, as if she were being chased. Dashing past the stunned secretary, she dashed into the ladies' room and there, standing over the sink, splashed a handful of ice-cold water in her face to calm herself and make her face finally stop blazing like a red flag. After refreshing and calming down a bit, she was about to go back to her office and continue her work when suddenly Betty walked into the bathroom. Adriana could hardly bring herself to remain calm. Proudly squaring her shoulders, raising her chin, she was about to precede Betty past her to the door, but she was suddenly struck in the back. "You're looking at Ethan, and for nothing." Adriana didn't even realize it was Ethan, and when she did, she almost choked. "What do you mean by that?" She turned around and asked Betty, with a testing look on her face. "At least don't play dumb with me." Betty smiled condescendingly. "Maybe you can do it to him, but not to me. I can see you drooling over him. Did you think I was mumbling?" Adriana tilted her head, not too confidently, showing off her slender swan, her neck, and laughed gleefully as if it were the funniest thing she'd ever heard in her life. "I thought, dear, you've had a crush on him for a long time. I'm not blind, but you're wasting your breath on the likes of you. He doesn't even pay attention." Adriana couldn't resist a sarcastic remark. "And what kind of people does he pay attention to?" "People like you." Betty nodded. "And why not? He and I are alike, and we know each other. We went to university together for 100 years. Our parents are friends, so why shouldn't we get married? We make a great couple. I am a man of his circle, and you are not." "I'm sorry, dearie, but it's not your level," Adriana interjected in an uncomprehending way. Well, if it makes more sense to you, I'll put it another way. Don't go where you can't go. But Adriana had already come to her senses. Apparently, the limit of humiliation for the day was exhausted. She squinted unkindly and said coldly, looking Betty in the eye, "I don't recall us being on a first-name basis. But since you insist, all right, I heard you. But remember once and for all, I decide where I go." She finished snidely, and Betty stared at her in amazement. "What do I hear?" Our mutt's voice broke through. "Don't yowl. Too loud can shut you up. Better a little mutt than a big one without a word in edgewise." Adriana paused expressively, eloquently, and noted the way Betty's eyes widened. "Then a big dog?" She finished nonchalantly, and then opened the door and walked out of the bathroom, leaving Betty bewildered by this impertinence. Of course, Adriana wasn't as cocky as she wanted to seem. Still, she was proud that she hadn't shown Betty her weakness. It was unfortunate, of course, that she had seen Adriana's sympathy for Ethan, but she couldn't prove anything anyway. Ever since then, Adriana had been catching more and more of Betty's gaze, which was unkind. She felt uncomfortable. She wanted to shiver, to put her arms around her shoulders, to shield herself from that scanning gaze. Ethan, on the other hand, looked at Adriana more affably. Where before he'd moved swiftly around the office, hardly looking at anyone, now he could just stop by Adriana's desk and chat with her about something unrelated to work. At first, she didn't know how to react. She was indignant, embarrassed, mumbling something indecipherable. But gradually she relaxed and began to accept his company more calmly. They chatted happily about trivialities unrelated to business, about the new movie, about the acclaimed weather book. One day, Ethan asked Adriana to go out to lunch with him. She was so confused and frightened that she immediately lied out of fear that she wasn't hungry. Ethan did not seem to believe her, but nodded and went out anyway. "Stupid," Adriana said to herself in despair. "Why am I so stupid? Why didn't I go to lunch with him?" Ethan soon returned and put a glass of aromatic coffee and a piece of apple pie from a nearby bakery on the table in front of her. "You can't work on an empty stomach," he said. Seriously, though, in his eyes. At that, mischievous little devils danced in his eyes. Outraged by his attention, Adriana muttered, "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" Ethan grinned enigmatically. "I won't repay it in money." "With what?" Adriana confusedly fluttered her eyelashes. "Come with me to the theater tonight." Ethan smiled and offered. "To the theater?" Stupidly, Anna asked again. Ethan nodded. "Well, yes. A director I know sent 2 tickets to the opening night. It should be interesting." She hesitated, not knowing how to do the right thing. "Why didn't you invite Betty?" she asked at last. Ethan raised his eyebrows ironically. "Maybe because I don't want to go with her, but with you." Adriana's ears were filled with Betty's sultry, mocking voice. "Not your level, don't go where you can't go." She looked Ethan in the eye and nodded seriously. "All right, Ethan, I'll keep you company." They had a wonderful time. They both enjoyed the performance. After the theater, Ethan took Adriana out to dinner and then drove her home in his car. "Will you invite her in for a cup of coffee?" he asked with a smile. Adriana shook her head to lead him to her murdered one-room apartment. Yes, she would not survive such an embarrassment. Another time. Nervously, she retorted, and immediately she bit her tongue. Why did she even know there would be a next time? Her arrogance was uncanny. "Well," nodded her supervisor, agreeably. Right now, though, she didn't see him as a boss. There was a stunning, handsome man beside her, and she liked him to the point of trembling in her knees, to the point of goosebumps all over her body, to the point of butterflies in her stomach. In that case, I might get a thank you for the evening. At least this. Suddenly, Ethan asked, and before Adriana knew it, he was already touching her lips with a gentle, light kiss. She felt dizzy from his scent and taste. Adriana closed her eyes and thought that perhaps she would agree to die right now at this very moment, because it was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her in her life. "I've wanted to do that for so long," Ethan said huskily, pulling away from her. "Adriana, you drive me crazy." And she, looking into his, eyes which now even more darkened with passion, and only managed to exhale happily. "And you me." And so their romance began. Adriana couldn't even dream of such a thing. Ethan wooed her touchingly and beautifully. He gave her flowers, made not too expensive, but nice gifts, because she refused expensive ones. Invited her to concerts, plays, and interesting exhibitions at the office. They did not advertise their relationship and tried to behave only as colleagues. But probably there were sparks between them, because the glances that Betty threw at Adriana got angrier and angrier every day. "Did you and Betty have anything going on?" she asked cautiously, as Adriana did. Ethan was surprised by the question, and even asked again with Betty. "Of course not. Why do you ask?" Adriana hesitated. "It's just the way she acts, the way she looks at you, as if she's entitled to you." "Never mind that." Ethan laughed. He waved his hand. "Yes, our parents had the idea of marrying us once. But it was stupid. Why silly? I don't love her. She doesn't love me. What kind of marriage would that be?" Ethan shrugged his shoulders. Adriana wasn't really sure that Betty had absolutely no feelings for Ethan, but she preferred to keep her suspicions to herself and keep her guard up. Adriana, it seemed, was watching her intently and harder than usual, waiting for any slip-up or mistake on her part to immediately get at her throat. The opportunity soon presented itself. One day, Ethan's Benjamin were in a very important meeting, and they strictly told them not to let anyone in or connect with anyone. "Adriana, I'll be 5 minutes," the secretary said to her. "Our bosses are busy anyway, and I want to buy myself a bun. I haven't had anything in my mouth since this morning. At least I'll have a bun with my coffee." "Yeah, sure, I'll cover for you." Adriana nodded. And at that very moment, when she was left alone in the waiting room, an unfamiliar visitor entered the office at a brisk pace. "Good afternoon," greeted her Adriana. "What time do you have an appointment?" The visitor looked down at her with a haughty expression. She was a woman in her 50s, very stylishly dressed, well-groomed, and quite beautiful. "I don't need to make an appointment with Ethan," she said arrogantly. "I can go in and see him any time of the day or night." She headed straight for the door, but Adriana jumped out awkwardly and blocked her way. "I'm sorry, but Ethan told her not to let anyone in there now. An important meeting, I repeat." She gritted an icy tone through clenched teeth. "I am no one. I'm always allowed in." Adriana shook her head. But at that moment, Betty appeared out of nowhere. At the sight of the uninvited visitor, she spread a wide, sweet smile. "Ah, Kathy, what a surprise. What are you doing here?" "I just dropped in to see my son. And me, this person." The woman looked at Adriana with a disgusted look, not letting her son in. Adriana was speechless and blushing. But how could she have known it was his mother? And then Ethan did say, very strictly, not to be disturbed by any living soul. "Excuse me, Kathy." In an innocent voice, Betty said, reveling in the machine's humiliation. "She's just a trainee. Inexperienced, not professional. Doesn't know anything about our routines." Adriana gasped in indignation and humiliation. Yes, she did not know that this woman was Ethan's mother. But that was no reason to accuse her of being unprofessional. Kathy gave Adriana a contemptuous, condescending look. "They'll take anyone they can get their hands on. Tired," she sighed. "And then they're all their own misery." She sailed off to her son's office. "You really screwed up." Betty shook her head, looking at Adrian's. She couldn't hide her gloat. But as it turned out, that wasn't the worst of it. When Ethan decided to introduce Adriana's parents as his fiancée, Kathy was shocked that she had yelled, "You want to introduce this uneducated redneck into our family? Think what you say." Mom angrily snapped at her son. "Actually, this is my girlfriend and future wife. She's an educated and intelligent girl." Yes, I saw her educated, demonstrated a complete lack of good manners. Almost kicked me out of the office. Imagine that, Mother. Not everyone knows your face. Adriana acted strictly according to my instructions, but my mother did not give up. "She's not a match for you. She's a nobody with no clan, no name. There's no way in hell I'm going to consent to this marriage." Ethan's eyes squinted unkindly. Are you confused? Mother, I don't need your consent. We're not in the 19th century. Betty told me she didn't like the upstart either. Mother was adamant. Ethan shook his head. I certainly understand that you dream and see Betty and I getting married, but that's just not going to happen. I love Adriana and only her. Well, then don't expect us at your wedding, shouted the offended mother. My father and I would never, ever admit that plebeian. Of course, Ethan recounted the conversation to Adriana only in general terms, so she wouldn't be too upset. But she was upset all the same. No matter what you say, it's not very nice to be hated like that. When word got out in the office that she and Ethan were getting married, did Adriana's attitude immediately change? Betty predictably freaked out. But most surprisingly, Benjamin started looking at her like a wolf, too. That's what she didn't like. One night, Ethan left for court, and Adriana had to get home on her own. She had already left the office, but halfway there, she remembered that she had left her glasses on the desk. It could, of course, wait until tomorrow. But Adriana wanted to do some more work on the computer at home, and without her glasses, with her myopia, it was rather difficult. With a sigh, she turned abruptly and strode back. To her surprise, the lights were still on in the office. She was sure she was the last one to leave. She stepped cautiously into the reception area and listened. There were two voices coming from the office, one male and one female. She recognized Benjamin and Betty without difficulty. You don't understand, Betty told Benjamin angrily to his assistant. As long as Ethan is in his right mind, there's no way he's going to give up his share to me, and I'm sick and tired of being just a partner in this firm. I want to be its rightful owner, the owner, and now he's marrying that redneck. Betty was indignant, and Adriana realized she was the one she was talking about. Can you imagine if Ethan thought of making that fool his full partner? What else? Benjamin rushed in. I won't let that happen. Who's gonna ask you? Betty grinned. No, he said quietly. I can't let this marriage happen. We have to do everything we can to make Ethan change his mind. And how are you going to do that? Betty sighed. The idiot is head over heels in love. What did he see in her? No, she's all right as a woman. She's quite nice, Benjamin thoughtfully stretched out. But then he let out a hollow gasp. Apparently Betty had given him a poke or a punch. Oh, come, just kidding. She's not a colorless moth. That's exactly what Betty fervently affirmed. Adriana couldn't listen to any more of this and backed away. She fumbled for her glasses case on the desk and slipped noiselessly out of the office. She walked down the sidewalk to the bus stop and tried to digest what she had heard. Turns out Benjamin isn't such a loyal friend to Ethan. Since he was thinking of getting their whole firm to himself, maybe he should have warned Ethan about it. But Adriana wasn't sure he would take her words seriously. After all, Benjamin might say that she was making it up and Betty would confirm it. And then Adriana would be a complete fool in his eyes. And what could she possibly tell him? All she heard was an emotional conversation. You never know what you might say in the heat of the moment. Maybe Benjamin didn't really mean that he wanted to get the firm in the first place. All evening, Adriana decided that she shouldn't tell Ethan after all. When he returned from court, she greeted him with a hot dinner and an affectionate kiss. It was obvious that he was very tired. He certainly had no time for speculation now. Adriana decided that she would watch Benjamin and Betty in the office for a while. If she had any new information that compromised them, she would be sure to tell Ethan. This postponement cost her dearly. More than once that day, Adriana caught Benjamin's strange looks on her face. She was lost, nervous, confused by the sight of his eyes, and didn't understand why he was staring at her so much. Had he guessed that she'd overheard their conversation with Betty yesterday? I don't think so. She'd been very careful not to give herself away. But then what? When Ethan left the office briefly, Benjamin invited Adriana into his office. Come see me. Adriana rose from her seat and caught another strange look on her face. This time, Betty made her feel uncomfortable. What were those two up to? It turned out they were up to something nasty and scary. As soon as Adriana was in the office, Benjamin deftly clamped his hand over her mouth and knocked her down on the desk, simultaneously pulling up her skirt. Her eyes darkened with horror and disgust. She fell silent, unable to utter a word. She kicked herself, trying to slip out of his grip. But how could she? She wasn't strong enough. Benjamin ripped her blouse from her chest and pulled her pantyhose down. Adriana realized that she was going to die on the spot, ashamed, disgusted, and powerless with anger. At that moment, the office door swung open. Adriana almost cried with relief. What luck that Benjamin had forgotten to lock her in? But relief was premature. Ethan and Betty were standing in the doorway of the study. Before Adriana could open her mouth to explain what had just happened, Betty pointed triumphantly at Adriana and turned to Ethan. "Well, I told you no. She's always hitting on Benjamin. She won't let him get away with it. He doesn't know where to hide from her. He's poor." Adriana's eyes widened. "What is she talking about? It isn't true," she whispered pleadingly, looking at Ethan. Benjamin called me into the office himself and pounced. Ethan was as pale as chalk. He turned silently toward his partner and friend, waiting for an explanation. Betty was right. With a sigh, Benjamin confirmed, "I'm sorry, but your fiancé is literally giving me a hard time. Always hung up on me. He presses me to the side, or the breast, or the skirt up, or the cleavage. That's not true." Shocked, Adriana shouted, "It wasn't like that at all." So nonchalantly nodded Betty. "I've noticed that about her for a long time. Absolutely unprincipled and shameless. She probably didn't care who she was with, as long as she's with her master. The main thing is to get married. Let her husband's money begin to be spent." It was so monstrously unfair that Adriana didn't even find the strength to justify herself. Sobbing loudly and clamping her hands over her mouth so she wouldn't sob out loud, she stormed out of the office, not looking at Benjamin, Betty, or even Ethan anymore. She never returned to the office, nor did she return to Ethan's apartment. She just couldn't see him anymore. She couldn't forgive him for believing them and not her. How dare he believe, how dare he allow even for a moment the idea that she was unfaithful to him? Ethan never once called her again, not that she waited. Although, let's face it, of course she did. She waited for him to give her a chance to explain himself, to hear her out in a normal way. But obviously, he had already made up his mind. And therefore, his love was worthless. Adriana wrote the statement and delivered it through her secretary. She didn't have the energy to face her former boss. Face to face, by all appearances, they weren't so eager either. For the first week after what happened, Adriana did nothing but lie on her bed and cry. She didn't answer her friends' calls, didn't even go out to the store, didn't eat anything. She didn't feel like eating. At the mere thought of food, she immediately began to feel nauseous. When the nausea became regular and began to appear mostly in the morning, Adriana stopped sobbing. And suddenly she thought about the obvious thing that did not immediately occur to her. She put 2 and 2 together and put the dates together. Everything matched. Still, to make sure she was right, she forced herself to wash her face and get ready and walk out of the house to the nearest drugstore. There she bought several pregnancy tests at once to rule out a mistake. There could be no mistake, as it turned out. All the tests showed her equally bright double stripes. There was no more doubt. Adriana was expecting Ethan's child. She thought long and hard about whether she should tell him. Yes, they had parted on a very scandalous, ugly note, but still he was the father. He had a right to know. And at the same time, Adriana was afraid that if she told Ethan that she was pregnant, he would think that she had arranged it all on purpose and got pregnant to marry him quicker. Or worse, he'd pretend that the baby wasn't his, but Benjamin's. Adriana, it was scary to even think about it. She would not have survived such an embarrassment and another humiliation. She even considered writing him a letter along these lines. "Ethan, I ask nothing of you, much less demand. But I will not hide from the child who his father is. You can always see him if you want to." Sitting down at her laptop, she quickly typed the desired text and was about to click the mouse to send, when suddenly her eyes were hooked on a news headline: "The wedding of a famous Moscow lawyer," by clicking on the link. Adriana opened the whole article and read the famous Moscow lawyer Ethan, considered one of the most enviable bachelors in our country, announced his engagement. The bride became his longtime friend and colleague Betty. Adriana couldn't read any further, she just couldn't. Tears immediately covered her eyes. She covered her face with her hands and sat still for a while, trying to recover. Quickly, however, Ethan found a replacement for her. Betty must be triumphant. She had gotten her way. How long had she sat silent and motionless like that? Adriana couldn't remember. At last she wiped away her tears and glanced at the screen of her laptop, resolutely hovered over the cross in the corner of the window, closed the news portal, and then, without a second's hesitation, deleted the draft of her letter to Ethan. Never send it. Now that he was getting married, he certainly didn't want to hear about the baby. Her son was born a healthy, strong, and handsome boy, very much like his father. As soon as she looked into those clear brown eyes and saw the plump, swarthy cheeks, Adriana realized that from now on her son would be a lifelong reminder of her unhappy love, that she regretted nothing, nor did she regret not having an abortion. Perhaps she would have felt better without the child. But now, looking at her adorable baby boy, Adriana knew that she just couldn't live without him. Of course, Adriana knew that life as a single mother wasn't sugar, but she had no idea it would be this hard. It turned out that babies weren't just a sea of tenderness and affection. They were also dirty diapers. The sea, laundry, colic, gas, night feedings, sleep deprivation, children's illnesses, and the same days. She stopped keeping track of the days, weeks, and dates. Still, one day was exactly like the previous ones. Money was catastrophically in short supply. She grabbed every part-time job she could from home, giving legal advice online. This had to be done during the hours when Michael was asleep. But these earnings were not enough. Adriana was planning on going full-time at the office. But then Michael had to be placed in a nursery. True, we still had to wait. He was still too young. No one would take a baby to a nursery until he was 1.5 years old. Of course, it literally tore at her heart when she first left her baby in the nursery. How bitterly he cried, how he called out for his mother. Adriana ran away from the nursery and wiped away her tears. Feeling betrayed, getting a job in an office was not so easy. Employers, upon learning that she had a small child, were very reluctant to invite her for an interview and openly made it clear that employees with children were not a priority for them. Adriana was rejected in one law firm after another, even in regular notary offices. They did not want to hire a young mother and a single mother. This means that she will be on sick leave with her child all the time. There is no one else to help her. In the end, Adriana managed to get a job as an office manager. Yes, it wasn't her profession at all, but she didn't have to choose. The main thing was that she was offered a reasonable salary. And so Adriana ran through life. There were hardships, there were joys, there were sorrows. But there was no one she loved more than Michael. He was her mother's joy, her mother's sunshine. She tried not to think about Ethan. She didn't search the internet for information about him, didn't make inquiries. Her heart still ached, from time to time. But Adriana convinced herself that gradually it would pass. And now, 7 years after their last meeting, she saw Ethan again. But in what way was Adriana? Unsurely, he repeated with a slurred tongue. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she said, staring at him. Ethan shrugged. His lips were blue with cold. His hair and face were wet from the rain still falling. What she saw was simply unbelievable. A thin, sickly man. And yet it was Ethan. What had happened to him in life? Why had fate treated him so cruelly? Strangely enough, though Adriana had many reasons to resent Ethan and blame him for all her troubles, now, looking at him, she felt neither gloat nor satisfaction. All she felt was pity. "What has happened to you? Where is your home? Let me walk you home." Ethan shook his head. "I don't have a home." "Wait, how is that possible? What about your family, your wife, your mother?" Adriana asked. "I have no one," Ethan pronounced clearly. "No one at all." She threw up her hands. "There's no such thing. There is, as you can see, no one at all." "Okay." Adriana made up her mind. She gripped the handles of his wheelchair tightly. "We'll go to my house now, and you can tell me everything in peace and warmth." Could she have done otherwise? It was the only right thing to do in this situation. But Ethan was clearly confused. To you, confused? He asked again. Would your family mind? The only family I have is my son. Adriana grinned. Ethan looked tense. And your husband? My husband hasn't lived with us for a long time. Adriana lied, not wanting to tell him the details of what she was. I've never been married. No need for him to know that the child is his. At least while getting to the place was not so easy. The porch of Adriana's house was equipped with a handicapped ramp, and she was able to wheel the stroller safely into the entryway. But there was no ramp in the entryway. She was blocked by a seemingly small obstacle. There were only 5 steps up to the elevator. But how insurmountable did they seem to her now? I can stand and move around a little as long as I hold on to the railing. Embarrassed, Ethan said. He was clearly embarrassed that Adriana had witnessed his helplessness. Well, that's good. She was happy. Why don't you stay here for a while I lift the stroller? And then I'll help you up too. Done. Adriana took the chair 5 steps up, left it on the landing, and went down to get Ethan. He held on to the banister with one hand and Adriana with the other, and gingerly moving his legs, he finally managed to overcome the climb. He was visibly uneasy when he slid back into the chair. His legs were trembling with fatigue, and drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. Adriana watched him surreptitiously and bit her lip. How could it be that the once healthy, energetic, full of strength man had turned into a helpless invalid? At home, the first thing she did was to help Ethan get to the bathroom. He needed hot water to keep warm. He was already freezing outside the church and brought a clean towel and a warm terry cloth robe. She showed him where the shampoo, soap, and other bathing things were. If you want, I can help you wash, she offered, but Ethan blushed. Thank you, I'll do it myself. Don't be shy, what haven't I seen you do? She couldn't help the joke. Ethan's lips touched a faint smile. Could you get me a stool, he asked, so he could get in and out of the tub. Don't worry, my arms are strong, like all wheelchair users. And she left him alone. While Ethan warmed up and bathed, she gave Michael a shot of antipyretic and sprayed his throat with cough spray. Who's that uncle? My son asked in a whisper, listening to the sound of the bathwater pouring. That's your father. Adriana was about to blurt it out, but she bit her tongue before she could. It's an old friend of mine who's in trouble. He really needs my help, so he's going to stay with us for a while. If you don't mind. Michael, with a calm and very serious nod. I don't mind. It is hard for a woman to be alone without a man. Yes, Mama. She was taken aback for a moment, and then she laughed merrily and ruffled his hair. That's quite a statement. Where did you get that from? My little philosopher, my neighbor used to say in the kindergarten, the boy explained. She knows life firsthand. Adriana sighed and hugged her son. Then she fed her son hot broth, and he quickly fell asleep. Meanwhile, the noise of water in the bathtub subsided. Adriana waited a little for propriety and went inside to ask if he needed help. Ethan had already wiped himself off and put on his robe. And now Adriana carefully picked him up under his elbow and led him out of the bathroom. You can get to the kitchen with my help, she said. You can't get around in a wheelchair in our narrow corridors. You can't do much with a stroller in our narrow hallways. Ethan nodded gratefully. Thank you. Seating the man at the table, she put in front of him a deep bowl of broth, sliced black bread, put a portion of macaroni and cheese, and took out a jar of pickles. As the saying goes, the rich are welcome. A little guiltily, she said. Thank you, Adriana said in a shaky voice. Judging by his haggard appearance, he had been starving for the past few months. And now he was unspeakably happy, even with simple and uncomplicated food, so as not to embarrass him. Adriana turned away and went to the stove to put the kettle on. Once again, she shared the vicissitudes of fate. Who would have thought that once the most enviable rich groom of the capital, and indeed of the whole country, was now sitting in her kitchen, because he did not have his own house, and flying a simple modest dinner, putting a cup of fresh mint tea on the table in front of him. Adriana sat down next to him and looked Ethan intently in the eye. It's time we had a serious talk. Tell me what happened to you. Softly, Adriana asked. Ethan grinned bitterly. Can't you see for yourself? I have become a wretched invalid. A cripple. I no longer have a business. It was taken away by my parents who died in an accident. I am very sorry, she said sincerely and stroked his hand. What happened to the business? I was set up. Ethan sighed. Sneaky, used, and betrayed. Adriana gasped. Who set you up? My friend and partner Benjamin. You must remember him. And also my wife Betty, who also happened to be his mistress. That can't be. Adriana exclaimed. Unfortunately, it can. Though I refused to believe it myself at first. Ethan shook his head. One word at a time, and he told her the whole of his unhappy story. It turned out that Benjamin had really dreamed of becoming the sole owner of their firm without any partners. However, that was impossible. Ethan in his right mind would never give up his share in the company. So Benjamin, along with Betty, devised a cunning plan. Betty married Ethan. A couple of years later, Benjamin paid some criminal mastermind a lot of money. Thanks to his profession, he had many acquaintances among the gangsters. The authority, with the help of his men, set up an accident, messed up the brakes in the car in which Ethan's parents were riding. And he himself, the driver, and his father and mother died instantly. But Ethan survived, transforming from a healthy man into his miserable likeness. But sometime later, it turned out that Benjamin now owned all the rights to the firm. Adriana didn't understand, and his eyes slammed shut. But how could this happen? Ethan sighed while I was lying in the hospital, recovering from the accident, depressed over the death of my parents. Betty kept slipping me papers to sign. She said it was for work, and I looked away, signed without reading. Adriana guessed. Ethan nodded. Exactly. In the end, when I was discharged from the hospital, it turned out that I no longer had an apartment, no firm, no wife. What the ultimate meanness? Adriana shook her head. And that's when I remembered that episode when I caught you and Benjamin in the office. And Betty confirmed that you were always chasing him. That wasn't true. They set me up. Adriana exclaimed indignantly. I get it, Adriana. I get it now. I didn't even want to listen to you then. If you knew how I blamed myself for it, how I longed for you and kept on loving you. It's a strange kind of love. Adriana couldn't help a sarcastic chuckle. Not even a month after we broke up, and you've already announced your marriage to someone else. I just wanted to forget myself, he sighed. I thought it was the wedge that drove the wedge. I thought I'd marry Betty and forget about you. And I did. Adriana asked softly. Ethan looked her straight in the eye and shook his head no. She put Ethan to bed on the couch and lay down with her son herself. Tomorrow I have to go to work, said Adriana, before she went to sleep. Michael is a little sick at daycare. I won't take him, but I haven't opened my sick leave yet. It won't be too much trouble for you if I ask you to babysit him tomorrow night. Of course, Adriana responded readily. He would love to babysit your son. I'll write down on a piece of paper what medicines he should take. She was delighted. There's nothing complicated there. He is an independent and not capricious boy. He takes his pills without any fuss, and he eats whatever you offer him. Okay, thank you. She's happy. You're going to help me out so much, because I'm already getting a bad look at work because of all the sick days. Thank you for that, Ethan said quietly. Adriana spent the next day at work thinking about how she was doing at home, constantly wondering how things were going at home. Her men are big and small. What if Michael is shy about taking care of a stranger's uncle? And she's good too, leaving her son with who knows who. It's not who knows who, it's his father. She reminded herself, yes, but neither Michael nor Ethan knew that. But her fears were all in vain. When Adriana opened the door with her key, out of breath and agitated, she caught the delicious smell of fried potatoes. Her stomach immediately roared with hunger. She'd been so wrapped up at work that she hadn't even had lunch. Or rather, Adriana deliberately chose to neglect lunch so she wouldn't have to spend the last penny she had left before her paycheck. Mommy came into the hallway, and a smiling and satisfied Michael jumped out and immediately rushed out into a hug. Hooray! Well, how are you here? Taking off the down jacket, Adriana asked, and touched her lips to her son's cheek. "Everything is ok. How are you feeling?" "Everything is super important," my son declared. Uncle Ethan fixed the outlet in the kitchen. He'd also made me a sailboat and an airplane, and we fried potatoes together. I even helped him peel them. Ethan also showed up in the hallway. He rode out there in his stroller, saw Adriana, and smiled. "You have a wonderful son," he declared. "I think we got along very well. Not with you, but with us," Adriana mentally corrected him, but she never dared to say it out loud. At dinner with an appetite, devouring some really delicious potatoes, she suddenly said, "Look, Ethan, why haven't you tried to fight, to sue for your firm? You're a great lawyer, a classy, experienced lawyer. It would be a piece of cake to prove Benjamin and Betty's guilt if you wanted to." "I just didn't have the energy or resources," Ethan responded to that. "First, I was crushed by the death of my parents, then by my own helplessness, and then by the betrayal of my friend and wife. I figured I just didn't have anything to fight for. In the name of what? In the name of whom? I was alone in the world. Did it matter what happened to me? Would I die under a fence or in my own bed?" Adriana shook her head and gently took Ethan's hand. "I care, Ethan," she said. "I really want you to get your company back. Punish those things through the courts." Ethan's eyes flashed, "You know. It is theoretically possible. The chances are very high. But I have to do a lot of paperwork, pull up a pile of old papers, archives. And I don't even have a laptop," he grinned. "Guilty. You can use my computer while I'm at work," graciously allowed Adriana. "It's old, but it works, so you get all the information you need. You have to restore justice. And I'll help you in any way I can. After all, although I do not work as a lawyer, but I believe that the knowledge obtained in the law school is not completely gone out of my head." "You're a miracle," Ethan said and kissed her hand. "I would be grateful if you could help me. You can't be serious. It might work out. What about your health?" With a gentle nod at his wheelchair, Adriana asked what the doctor's prognosis is. "Will you be able to get back on your feet?" Ethan darkened. "I don't know. It's 50-50. They say that in principle anything is possible. But you need special therapeutic exercise, massage, exercise, and of course, the desire to get better. Before that, I did not care about my condition. But now you know, I think there really is something worth living for. Michael had spinal problems as a child. Adriana said specifically to give him a massage. I graduated from a professional course. So, if you want, I can give you a massage too. I don't know if it would help, but it wouldn't make it worse." Ethan shook his head as he stared at her. "Sometimes I think you're an angel sent from heaven." Of course, it was easier and faster in theory than in practice. In reality, the process dragged on for months. Ethan contacted some of his former colleagues he could completely trust on the internet, re-established crucial connections, and with support, began compiling dossiers on Benjamin and Betty. Neither his ex-wife nor his former friend and partner suspected that Ethan was digging into them. Surely they were sure he had long since died under a fence or in a shelter for the homeless. Adriana was also relieved because Ethan had taken over all the household chores. He cooked, did the laundry, and even cleaned. Despite his condition, he was still quite dexterous. In addition, Adriana gave him regular massages, as she had promised. And with each passing day, Ethan became more and more confident on his feet. He was still moving, though, on the wall. But still, compared to the state he was in. When Adriana met him outside the church, progress was evident. Michael had become quite attached to Uncle Ethan, as he continued to call him sometimes Adriana. She wanted to tell them both the truth, but she stopped herself every time. One day, Ethan found out the truth for himself. Adriana returned from work, unsuspecting. "Boys, I'm home," she shouted. "Hi, Mom." Michael called back from his room, still watching his cartoons. Ethan went out into the hallway. He walked unsteadily, shuffling his feet, but all by himself. He was so excited. Adriana was so happy. "You're making progress. You might start running soon." Ethan, however, silently crossed his arms over his chest and stared into her face, testing her. What's the matter? She looked frightened. Why are you looking at me like that? Today, I accidentally came across scans of your documents on my computer. He said in a calm voice. Michael's birth certificate. Adriana became cold. Already she understood what he was getting at. You have never been married. He shook his head. There's no divorce stamp in your passport, no marriage registration. And Michael was born 8 months after we broke up. That means you left me already pregnant. Is there anything you want to explain to me? Adriana lowered her head low. I was afraid, she babbled. She was afraid. Ethan banged his fist on the wall in anger. Did I have no right to know I was having a baby? I thought you wouldn't believe me. Well, a baby from you, babbled confusedly Adriana, but I honestly wanted to tell you everything. And then I saw the news on the internet that you were marrying Betty. Why didn't you tell me the truth now? He asked me quietly when she took me to her house, introduced me to her son. Why did you decide to leave me Uncle Ethan in his eyes? Adriana, guilty, sighed. Ethan squinted unkindly. Let me guess. You were embarrassed to admit to the kid that his father was disabled. You thought he'd be ashamed of me. Adriana gasped. Ethan, are you out of your mind? That's not the point at all. What is it then? I'm waiting for an explanation. At first I kept waiting for the right moment to tell you, and then you got carried away with the idea of getting your own business back. And I thought that if you succeeded, you wouldn't need me and Michael. What? He asked me again. You don't. But you'll be rich and famous again. And us? We're not your kind of people. But we have a place in your new happy life? What a fool you are, Adriana said. Ethan shook his head. Don't you understand anything yet? What am I supposed to understand? Adriana babbled. That I was doing all this only for your sake, for my sake, Adriana asked incredulously. But of course, to get back, or rather to deserve your love, because I still have mine. Adriana couldn't help it and threw herself on his neck in tears. My love has always been with you too. She exhaled and burst into tears. 5 years later, all the most famous lawyers gathered at the anniversary party of a famous law firm. It was a magnificent reception. Waiters brought guests a flute of iced champagne and trays of gourmet treats. A live orchestra played. The ladies were striking in their gowns. One more beautiful than the next. Still, no one was more beautiful that day than the hostess of the party. The wife of the owner of the company and also his business partner. The beautiful Adriana attracted the eyes of the guests and the journalists. Slim, stylish, and well-groomed. She smiled dazzlingly and answered questions. Tell me, Adriana, is it true that you and Ethan had a bad time? Of course it's true. Adriana nodded. There was even a period when we ate empty pasta and fried potatoes. Because there wasn't enough money for meat. The journalist laughed, taking it as a good joke. But Adriana knew it was all true. Back then, 5 years ago, they were literally starting from scratch, and they had made it. Had they achieved what they wanted? Benjamin and Betty had been indicted, and now the pair were serving time in the not-so-distant places. Ethan managed to get his firm back, and he immediately made Adriana his partner, because she was the only person in the world someone he could trust. A month later, they were finally married. Michael was unspeakably happy about it, because he had already grown attached to Uncle Ethan, or rather, to his father. He quickly got used to calling him that, and he was the best daddy in the world. Is that where you heard it? Adriana's voice distracted her from her memories. Ethan came up to her, stunningly handsome in his new tuxedo, like a movie actor at the Academy Awards. You've got your hands full tonight with the guests and the reporters. He teased her. You can't spare a minute for your own husband either. Adriana grinned and made an appointment. I have an opening next week. Oh, you? Not at all embarrassed by the camera flashes and prying eyes. Ethan kissed his wife right on the lips. People are watching crazy, she laughed. She, however, did not resist much. By the way, Mr. Ethan, I have very valuable and important news for you. Is that how Mistress Adriana picked it up? Yes, yes. Top secret information, Ethan. I'm listening to you, Adriana. In about 7 months. Yes, I believe that in 7, there will be 4 of us in the family. My eyes, Ethan, are wide open. You mean that? Yes, Adriana nodded, glowing. You're going to be a dad for the second time, and I can't hold back any longer. Ethan pulled his wife to him and hugged her tenderly. A beautiful couple, the guests whispered, admiring them. And few of them had any idea what trials of meanness, hardship, and betrayal they had gone through to finally earn their long-awaited and hard-won happiness, a happiness they would never give to anyone else.